I love humanity. This extraordinary entity born on Earth, endowed with many capacities of evolution, but also many defects that played a leading role during its period of exodus. Undeniably the most fascinating period in the history of a civilization, because being the period during which this civilization leaves its natal celestial body. The Tekka Space Agency has played an essential role in this era of humanity, because it is thanks to it that humanity has finally been able to spread throughout the universe. But this story was really long. So that you really understand what I'm talking about, I'm going to tell you this story. Don't try to know who I am, when I am, or where I am. Enjoy this story as if you were discovering a part of humanity that could never have been predicted. This story begins about 20 years after the fall of all space agencies due to lack of funding in a Cold War context. Indeed, the number of satellites sent into orbit was sufficient, and few countries still had hope for the second race to the moon. Some small nations or small private companies had nevertheless reinvented themselves to continue space research, but all this work had not led to much. A small company called Tekka Lab, looking to develop a particular engine, was part of it. But like all the others, the fate of the Cold War made it lose more and more financiers, and therefore more money, until it had to collapse. But 3 days before the signing of the closure of Tekka Lab, a wealthy man named Alexander Whitford was interested by this company, taking an interest in it, because it had achieved something hitherto never realized, and which had a huge potential. This company had succeeded in making the first successful combustion, lasting 10 seconds, of an thermoelectrolytic anatronic engine to the shortcut of Tekka engine, and which gave its name to this company, because it was the one which had invented it, and only worked on its development. Alexander Whitford was the 10th richest man on the planet, and therefore owned many companies. He therefore asked his engineers to estimate the probability of success of this engine with his means. And although this probability was low, he bought Tekka Lab for a few $1 million the next day. The next day, he began a recruitment campaign to multiply by 17 the number of Tekka Lab employees, and thus hoped to see this engine work more than 10 seconds without exploding. He also began the construction of some research buildings, and even a rocket assembly building, easily expressing his ambitions. The world was not with him, and people said that even with a powerful rocket, and with the best engine possible, he would only lose money in that time of Cold War, because no one would need his rocket. But he only followed his intuition, and he did it well. 3 months later, on a brand new test bench, the Tekka Engine 7, larger than its predecessors, fired for the first time. It exploded. It was a year later that the Tekka Engine 21 proved to the world that, finally, it was possible to master a thermoelectrolytic anatronic engine. Despite this success, everyone in the world did not change its mind. Indeed, explosions were still frequent, because at the slightest movement, the pumps formed swirling currents that overheated the engine and were impossible to eliminate, but that the engineers of Tekka Lab tried to reduce with the acquired data. There was still a lot of work ahead of a reliable engine, and Alexander Whitford knew it. Thus, in the meantime, he began the first studies about a possible rocket, but especially about a possible ship. A year later, the boss of Tekka Lab held a large open conference to present the major changes of his company, despite the fact that few people at that time believed in the utility of rocket. In fact, there were only journalists there who were preparing their next article to criticize the billionaire about the uselessness of his work. But he was confident, very confident. He began his lecture with an unexpected change. Tekka Lab was renamed Tekka Space Agency, or TSA. An ambitious change, but which allowed him to present his space ambitions focused on the design of a ship named Tekka Ship, sent into space by a first stage named Tekka Booster, both equipped with a single engine each, a Tekka engine. So powerful compared to older engines that it would use 3 times less fuel for the same power. This revolutionary property, which had just been proven on the test bench thanks to the Tekka Engine 42, would make it possible to land the booster and the ship without parachute, then to reuse them. But this property also allowed other advantages, such as for the booster, to push the ship to a trajectory taking it up to 600 kilometers of altitude before it begins its propulsion, and, for the ship, significantly reduce the place of fuel, leaving a huge place for the cargo bay. He explained that this cargo bay would be the key to the TSA, as it would be equipped with a door to open and close it, making it go out and enter payloads, but also allowing it to be fully pressurized, leaving a huge space for astronauts. These could, for example, repair, without a suit, satellites in the pressurized cargo bay after having brought them in. He showed how astronauts would lodge in a crew deck below, all the time pressurized, with access to the cargo bay through a small ladder in the center of the floor. This floor would be divided into two parts, a living side, with beds, kitchen, living room, laundry, bathroom, and toilet, and a technical side, with computers, passenger seats, and the technical room. This vision of a futuristic spacecraft that could carry up to 10 passengers in orbit for months convinced 5% of journalists, but the rest did not change their mind. They did not believe it. He also presented an original way of annotating the ships and boosters of their number. Indeed, they would not only carry their number on the fuselage, but they would carry their number in binary number thanks to lines on segments, from bottom to top above the heat shield for the booster, and from bottom to top on the cargo bay for the ship. He called it the code of a ship or the code of a booster, and explained that thus it would be possible to see the number of a vehicle from afar. Before finishing his lecture, Alexander Whitford explained that the next day the first Tekka ship, TS-1, would leave the assembly building to make the first flight of a ship. This flight would be called TSM-1 from Tekka Space Mission 1, and would be a takeoff, then a landing of the ship, to show that the Tekka engine is for the moment quite reliable, although it will always have to be improved again and again. So, the next day, everything went according to plan, until the time came to launch the first mission of the Tekka Space Agency, whose launch site flocked journalists ready to film every moment of this first jump. To not miss the best image of the explosion of this ship, and to be able to at best criticize the boss of the TSA. But time seemed to stop for the employees and the few fans. Then came the end of the countdown. The time to start the Tekka Engine 45. It was not so serious that the ship exploded like this. This was an empty prototype, with the crew deck empty, and with a cargo bay model without door or even docking port. The purpose of this mission was simply to know if the engine would withstand such constraints. And so it was clear that it would not, but that's all the audience retained.